Well, hello! Welcome back to my channel. My name is Mildly Gothic. If you're new here, what I like to do is a variety of artsy content. But first things first, I got paintings! One of these has been done on my channel, which is that one right there. But these other ones are just a variety that I've done over, I don't necessarily remember how they're in frame, over the years that I really like. And so I have them here with me. So things are coming together slowly but surely. So what I have for you today is a painting. I know it's a little weird that I posted a video last week and here I am posting another video. Reason for that is I didn't want to only post today and have it have been a month since I posted a video. So instead I did a quick one last week and we've got another one today. This is going to be part 1 of 2, which is finishing this plank idea. My boyfriend was kind enough to buy me this random wooden plank thing at Michael's because I thought I could do something with it. It was only $10, it was on clearance, so we purchased it. And I sat there and I drew out a bunch of ideas wondering what to do with it, and I eventually came up with this really cool idea. So it's going to have these 2 juxtaposing images. One, they are both going to be a human skull, half of a human skull with an antler coming out, but one of them is going to have more mushrooms and moss and supposed to be darker, and the other one is going to be covered with flowers and vines, supposed to be lighter. Kind of a, dark and light, life and death, all that kind of jazz. So, I have part 1 for you today. Again, if I had 2 weeks to do this like normal, and I hadn't been moving, maybe this would be the full thing, but this honestly might be a shorter video. It depends on how much I decide to explain the process. But I think this first part turned out really, really cool, and I can't wait to show you how I did it. So if you like artsy content with a chaotic element to it, because I don't necessarily know how to do things in a calm way, feel free to check out the rest of my channel. Subscribe if you'd like to stick around in my weird little corner of the internet. We'd love to have you. And with all of that said, let's get to the video.
So let's start with an immediate lesson learned. I don't know why I did not sand this wooden plank. You can kind of see on camera that each of those sections has a completely different texture, which is, let's just say, inconvenient when trying to paint. So I did not sand it, I did not prep this wood, I literally bought it from Michael's, attempted to sketch out my design in pencil, and then went straight to painting it. So I skipped over sketching it in pencil because it was not that interesting of footage, but I just have a general idea of the outline and measurements of where the things need to be, so I went for it with painting. In order to try to address the color correction element of the different tones across the wood, I decided to base the skull out in a gray instead of just going for white, because that would give me a more even base across both planks of wood instead of just starting with white, which might show up worse on one than the other. Down the line, I think this was a great idea. And then I started basing out the entire antler in brown. The antler was interesting. I can't tell if it looks like truly an antler or if it just looks like wood, but I just started with brown and a mid-tone brown, just going with everything that I could. I spent a lot of time filling in the little fuzzy gaps in the more textured pieces of wood and trying to get that to actually look smooth and cohesive, which had mixed success at times, so, it ended up being all right. But one of the more interesting things that I dealt with on this project is the drying of the paint. The paint dried in a completely different tone than what I originally painted, so I spent a lot of time being very careful and purposeful with my layers so that I could try to get back some of that tone that was lost when the paint dried. So there were many times where the paint was very misleading with the original color that I put down. I was like, oh, this is perfect. And then I realized, no, it wasn't. It didn't actually leave behind the color that I thought it did. So there was a lot of layering and building it up. I decided to texture the antler with some little bits of lighter color, some little bits of darker color, different tones of brown, just trying to build up a little bit of dimension and life and character rather than leaving it a flat brown thing. And I think this was pretty successful. The method that I approached for the skull was, after I had the gray base, which I had to adjust a little bit because my original shape was not human, I decided to smatter white on top of it. My original layer was actually a cream tone instead of a white, so I could just try to figure out a little bit more of that basing in what I was doing. but I just layered the lighter colors on top of it. And this let me have a lot of control over where those shiny parts on the skull were, and also the actual texture. The really interesting thing is the way that I dabbed all of the lighter color onto the skull. It gave it this really cool, smooth, honestly almost bone-like texture, in my opinion, and I think just helps sell the final product like that much more. So I'm really happy with that technique on the skull, because it also then helps eliminate some of the problems of the texture of the wood. Now, I knew I wanted to do moss and mushrooms on this antler set, but I was not confident in the mushrooms, so I decided to start with what I was comfortable with, which was the moss. I again approached this from a technique of building up layers, so I laid out a variety of greens for myself, starting with a very dark base green, and a mid-tone, and then a lighter green, and then tried to build up these tones in different points across the antler where I thought it might be fun or cute to have moss kind of draping or wrapping. I tried to pay attention to the shape that the antler might have and give some of these curvature when it would be draping over the antler. I didn't want to artificially flatten my artwork by using the moss, essentially. If you don't pay attention to the curvature, you can impose a flatness to an image rather than imposing a shape to it. And I didn't want to do that. So just went back and forth across the different moss, layering up these colors. Again, I'm just dabbing these on. None of the moss was swipe brush painted. All of these were just dabbed on. And so I tried to use the technique of building up lighter colors in one area more than another to then artificially impose some more depth of color to the moss by bringing some areas of highlights or some darkers, because it's not just a flat patch. There might be some other three-dimensional stuff going on in the moss. So I think this was a really successful technique, and again, I had to let this dry so I could build up the layers more than once, but you know what, that's not really that big of a deal. The very last thing I decided to do to the moss was make it shiny. I have a green gold shimmer color metallic, and so I decided to dab a little bit of that all over the moss to just bring it to life a little bit, and I'm so pleased with how that came out because I think it just brought so much life and fun and color to the final product. So I wasn't entirely happy with the tone of the skull at this point, so I decided to go back in and darken the eye sockets up a little bit, emphasize that shading on the side to make that difference a little bit more obvious. And then, of course, contrast works both ways in light and dark, and so while I darkened to the darks, I then tried to lighten the lights, and so continued adding white to the highlight points of the skull, making sure to blend it out to the midtones, and I'm sure you'll notice most of the skull has some layer of white. That is because I did not want the base to be gray. I did want that mid-tone to be a kind of white tone, so most things got a one coat of white, and then I just continued to highlight the rest of the skull with the white as needed. Next is, so this is why I tried to sketch out my drawing in the first place, is so that I didn't have to try to make touch-ups, but I ended up having to make touch-ups on the skull and just try to blend it into the wood area because I decided that I didn't like the bounds of where the lower one was anymore, so I just tried to blend that out a little bit. So the next step is actually adding the mushrooms, and there was only one actual type of mushroom that I used in inspiration, and that is oyster mushrooms, growing on the side of trees in those really interesting clusters, and so I tried to mimic those, and then I also just tried to mimic your kind of classic bell-shaped mushroom, although in some fun different shapes and sizes. But I made the decision to base all of these out in white so that they would actually show up just a little bit more. I did end up going for colorful mushrooms, as you will see. I'm not entirely sure if that made it too whimsical, but I really like the final product, so you know what? I think it's perfectly all right. So here's part 2 of me realizing that I think I know how to draw skulls, but apparently I don't know how to paint them. I started the teeth and I did them all wrong. They ended up being all sorts of weird shapes, and I just couldn't get the lines right. And so I did the outline in gray so that it was a little bit softer. I didn't want the starkness of black to be the outline for the teeth. And I spent some time re-outlining them and filling in with white to try to make it more clear, and then trying to cover up the excess of the teeth to make things a little bit not as awful. So once I decided the teeth were done, I decided to turn back to the mushrooms and start actually basing them out in their first coat of color. The general color scheme that I decided to follow was the oyster mushrooms were going to be blue, light blue, and white for the big meaty part on the bottom. I don't really know a better way to describe that. And then a dark blue for the top, but we're going to start with that base of a light blue over everything. The large mushrooms were purple, and then those very, very small ones were going to be that bright cherry red that I think is classically associated with mushrooms. Once I started painting the tiny red ones, I did realize that I didn't have a second purple one, and that just kind of felt off. It didn't feel right to only have one of the purple mushrooms, so I decided instead to add a second set of the purple mushrooms up near the very tippy top of the antler. So the base colors on all of the mushrooms got a second coat. Most of my acrylics that come out of the bottles are very watery and not very saturated, so they tend to need a second coat. So I just went through to try to give the base color of all of my mushrooms a second coat to make them pop just that much more. I wanted to make sure you could actually see them and that they weren't going to blend into the wood tones of the background. So unfortunately, I did lose a bit of footage. My phone does not have quite that much storage, and I was not paying attention to how much I was filming, so I did lose a good bit of the footage in between. So you'll notice that the oyster mushrooms now have their blue tops, and the purple mushrooms have some extra shading. This was done to make them more dimensional and more dynamic, but what I'm adding now is the fun stuff. I have a variety of paints that are color shifting and basically duochromatic. I have these in red green, blue violet, green gold. I have these in a lot of different colors. Some have an extra pigment, some do not. So I picked the ones that I thought would go best with each color of mushroom. And you cannot see, but all of the mushrooms, I believe, at this point have already had this duochromatic thing applied to the mushrooms themselves. And I decided to add a highlight around all of the mushrooms and make the mushrooms themselves a light source. Because I thought the thing that this painting was missing was contrast and something dynamic, something to draw you in. And so I decided to make all of the mushrooms a light source in their own respective colors and own respective ways, so that it would make the piece a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more interesting to have these different colors and little glowing bits. I did my best to pay attention to points of the moss that would be highlighted, points of the antler that would be highlighted, and even points of the antler that wouldn't be highlighted due to the three-dimensional nature of the shape. I went through with the different colors and just really had fun with this. Also, you'll notice there are some tiny white mushrooms now. I decided I didn't have enough mushrooms, so I added some more mushrooms. Who can go wrong with some more mushrooms? This, I think, was probably my favorite part because I was finally seeing everything starting to come together and colors were making sense, things were just working, and it started looking just so wonderful. Now, even with the light source, it's not done, and that's because no light can be complete without the darkness on the other side. Contrast exists because of light and dark. So once I had finished adding the light to all of the mushrooms, I realized I had to go back in and add the contrast that would be the dark side of the antler that is not lit by the mushrooms themselves. So I mixed up a darker brown, and I started accentuating all of the parts of the antler that were hidden or that would be shadowed from the light. And I really think this was the step that started bringing everything together and emphasizing the light source and bringing in that strong, strong contrast. I haven't said it explicitly yet, but part of that adding contrast was adding shading specifically to under the moss. I'm sure you have seen me do it. I just wanted to emphasize and highlight that the moss is sitting on top of the antlers, not the other way around. Now, my boyfriend kindly pointed out the one thing that this painting was missing, and it was the one thing I was kind of avoiding, and that was adding moss to the skull. As soon as he said it, it was the most obvious thing in the world, and yet I hadn't done it yet. I do think I may have gone a little overboard with the moss on the forehead, but I think I ended up bringing it all together. This process followed the exact same process as the moss on the antlers, and that was starting with the dark green, layering up the light greens, and slowly building to a textured and kind of fluffy moss aesthetic, in all honesty. I think this absolutely tied everything together. I used this moss as an opportunity to hide the "how does that work" junction between the skull and the antler, because I don't know, I'm not an anatomy major. I'm just pretending that this mythical creature exists. So I used the moss as kind of an excuse to cover that up, But I just built up the colors and layers, and I think this really brought the whole thing together. And I am so exceptionally happy with part one of this painting. I really think that the juxtaposition is going to play really well. I think the second part is going to pull this whole thing together. And I'm really, really excited, especially for how it looks on the unpainted or unaltered wood of the plank that I just bought in the first place. I think this is a really, really interesting project and probably one of my favorites I've taken on as far as just a painting recently, and I can't wait to see how this thing finishes. So, thank you guys so much for sticking around and watching this far, and I hope you stick around for the next one.